Hi, my name is Gracie and in this video I'm going to be showing you how to sew this garment. This is the Titillating Tank top or dress. Now this comes in a multitude of views. Today we will be sewing the wide strap high neck mid scoop back in the dress version with one side slit, fully reversible. Other ways that you can sew this sewing pattern are as a top, as a crop, or there is a spaghetti strap scoop neck, which also has options for a lower scoop. This version has options for a higher scoop as well, so there's a few different ways that you can make this. Each different version has a few different steps to put together. Now, if you want to sew your own titillating tank, you can purchase the sewing pattern on my website, www.graciesteel.com. This pattern is intended for fabrics that have a 60% stretch. 4-way stretch is best. This is an example of one of the tops that is fully reversible. This is the spaghetti strap dress, and as you can see I embellished it for a bit of fun, and this is the mid scoop. Now this one has a shelf bra on the inside, so this one is not fully reversible, but it's got this little bra on the inside. This is made from quite a thin jersey spandex poly knit, I don't know, it's quite thin, whereas the reversible top is quite thick. So you can make this with a lot of different fabrics. I'll include all of the sizing information down below in the comments, but you can also find a lot more information about the pattern on the product description on my website. Alright, enough chitty chatty, let's dive in. So these are my front pieces that I have cut, and as you can see I am cutting my back strap here. It was a nightmare. Anyway, step one, we are going to sew the arm's eye and the neck, and then we're also going to sew the hem and up to the slit notch. So for this dress I'm using my sewing machine. It's just a regular domestic machine. I have attached my walking foot to help to feed the stretchy fabric and the sequins. I've also got just a regular universal needle on here to try and pierce through those sequins. So sequins are a little bit tricky and a little bit harder to sew than if I was just using a regular stretch fabric, but you know, I love a challenge. Now we have the option to use a zigzag or a lightning bolt stitch here, so this is me testing out my stitches. As you can see, I try and pull the thread tails out the back to help to feed the fabric at the start, and using the lightning stitch here I got a little bit tangled and it was a bit of a nightmare, and it was a dog's breakfast. Now, I don't have super great results with my lightning stitch. I tend to just use a regular zigzag. So, you know, this happens to everyone. Don't be afraid if your stitches don't work. Just get the thread out as gently as you can, snip it, rethread your machine if you need to, and then alter your stitch. So that was the zigzag. I didn't love it, so now I'm going to try using a few different regular zigzags instead of the lightning bolt stitch. So again, I'm tugging on that thread out the back to try and help it to start feeding, and I'm just sewing a little bit of a seam there on some scraps, checking that it's all sewing through there, and then I'm going to adjust my stitches a little bit to see what I like for this. So where I landed for this one was a 1.5 width and a 1.5 length, and I recommend testing your stitches on some scraps before you dive in. So here we go, that seam is looking pretty good. I've got a matching thread color, nothing's pulling, it's all looking pretty nice. So we are going in for the neckline first. So again, I'm giving that thread a bit of a tug. Now the seam allowance is 6 millimeters, which I believe is just a wink smaller than a 1/4 of an inch. Once I have done that, I'm going to understitch this here to try and keep those sequins flat, and to also try and keep the facing or the lining or the contrast towards the inside. So we're pretty much pressing the seam allowance over towards the inside pieces of fabric, and then we're going to stitch them down just next to the seam there. So you can see I'm trying to spread it all apart as I go through, and snip that thread there, and you can see that row of stitching is on the inside of the garment there, and that's going to help to hold everything in. So now we're going to do the same for the arm's eye. So one side at a time. And then we're going to understitch. Doop doop dee doo. Understitching is really, really great skill to have. A really great skill to have. Or a good tool. Now with this one I can't go all the way to the end, and so I'm doing a lock stitch on my machine so that it knots there and doesn't unravel. You can do a back stitch if your machine doesn't have a lock stitch. The lock stitch button on my machine is pretty much a dot with a circle around it. So we did the other arm's eye, the same thing, and now I am sewing along the hem. And then at the corner, I'm going to pivot and sew up one of the side seams to the highest notch. On this particular garment, I am only doing one side slit because I think it'll look pretty sexy to be closed on one side and open on the other. When I get to that notch there, I am going to back stitch a little bit just to lock that in there. Alright, so you can see that is sewn, sewn, sewn. We've got the hem, we've got the arm's eye, we've got the neck, and now I've flipped it right sides out, and I'm going to baste along those side seams down to the notch on one side and the entire length of the other. So this is fabric wrong sides together right now, because later we're going to be sewing this together with the back, and it will be 4 layers of fabric, which is going to get a little bit tricky to handle. Different fabrics are easier than others. This sequin, nightmare. So I'm doing anything that I can to make this as easy and neat as possible. So I'm just using a elongated straight stitch here, straight down those side seams within my seam allowance. So now we've got to do pretty much all of that with the back. So we're starting with the back neckline. Now this fabric doesn't have a heap of stretch to it, and the lining is quite a firm lycra, so I'm not going to bother with adding elastic into these seams, but if you have a fabric that does not recover well, I would very, very strongly recommend adding in elastic. So I have just sewn that back neckline, and then we've just understitched that there, and now I am sewing the back arm's eyes. With this one, I wasn't going to be able to reach very far with the understitching for this mid scoop, and so I skipped it, but do what you can. I find that the understitching is most important for the necklines, not quite as important on the arm's eyes, but don't tell anyone I said that. Anyway, so that is the neck and the arm size, and now we're going to do the same for the side slit and the hem. Now because I want the hem, the slit on the right side of my leg, I've got to make sure that this is going down the opposite side because this is the back piece, if that makes any sense. Picturing, you know, which side is the right side and the wrong side for the front and back, the left and right. Just something to be mindful of if you are sewing a single slit. Now, what I didn't do just then when I was sewing my hem, I forgot to leave a little opening to turn it through. If you do that, don't worry, we can just unpick a little hole here. So that's pretty important to have. Now the hem is a bit easier than having it in the arm side, but put it where you need. So this is my back piece, and I have it right sides together currently. And now this is my front piece, and this is right sides out. Look at that sequin, oh my gosh. So now we are going to sandwich the front in between the back. So I'm feeding all the corners and the seams to match up together. This is probably the trickiest part. This part took a really long time, but that's mostly because of these devilishly beautiful sequins. So first up, I was sandwiching in that slit corner, and now we are going to use a bodkin to thread the front strap up into the back strap there. Again, this was super tricky because of those sequins. Anywho, those upper edges are now matching and I have not twisted them, and so now we are sandwiching the upper corner under one of the arms essentially. And this is where we've got that front piece that we previously basted together. You know, we can treat that as one now because we've already secured that, and then we've just got to sandwich it between the back, main and lining. Now, take your time with this. I tend to do one side at a time depending on my fabric. You really do want to make sure though that all 4 layers are matching. And now we are going to sew those side seams. So I'm using my zigzag stitch again at that 6mm seam allowance, which is the same seam allowance the entire way through. I've used a combination of pins and clips here because again, these sequins were so hard. Anywho, we are almost at the top of one corner, and then we've just got the other side seam and the straps. These were also really tricky. Sometimes I find with the straps it's easy to start in the center and go towards one side, and then to flip it and start from the center and go to the other side again, instead of going just from one edge all the way to the other. So that's a little handy trick that can help sometimes. For these straps, you can use a straight stitch because you don't need this seam to stretch at all. It is also good practice to trim your bulk here. And there are my straps all secured. So now I've got to pin the other side in place. This took me another million years. And really making sure that that side slit was totally sandwiched in there. Some of these things that I'm saying and showing probably don't make a lot of sense, but then when you actually do it, it's like, that's what she meant. And I think that that's sewing in a nutshell. So hopefully this video, together with the instructions booklet, with the pictures and the words, hopefully this is all easy for you. And we are almost at the grand finale. So now everything is sewn. All we have to do is turn it out through that little hole that we left. So people like to call this when the garment births itself, and just be gentle with this. Try not to force anything. Just take a little bit of fabric each little pull, because you don't want to stretch out that opening too far. And then all you've got left to do is ladder stitch it closed. So to sew the ladder stitch, we're going to be using a hand sewing needle and some thread. I tend to double my thread over and knot it here just to make it nice and strong. So you want to fold that hem in on that imaginary seam line. So as if it didn't have a hole there, where would those two pieces be connected? Now, obviously these sequins are going to make this extra tricky. Then we're going to take our hand sewing needle, and I like to pop this from the inside of the garment so that the thread tail's hidden on the inside, and then flip it back over as you can see here. And now we're going to sort of zigzag up and forth along the two edges. So you enter one side, travel down a bit, and then exit, and then go straight over to the other side. And I'm starting by going right a little bit, but now I'm going to turn around and go left here. This is my favorite hand sewing stitch ever. Now, if you sew this pattern, please tag me on Instagram at @bygraciesteele and hashtag titillating tank or titillating tank dress. Now, to finish off our seam, we're going to take our needle and poke it through so that it exits pretty far upstream, I suppose, and then we're going to snip it nice and close to the fabric there, and that's going to leave a nice long thread tail on the inside so that it's not dangling out. Here is my titillating tank dress hot off the machine. I feel sexy as all hell, and I hope that if you sew one, you do too.